Welcome to another at History Gems. Today, historic branding, specifically dynastic branding. Let's go back to the year 1100 AD, when the King of England, William Rufus, died in a hunting accident. Fortunately, his younger brother just happened to be at the Royal Mint at that stage, and as he was conveniently in England, and as he was conveniently basically in charge of all the money at that point, they very kindly asked him to become king. He became King Henry, but history would remember him as Henry I. The reason for that, of course, is that there were 8 Henrys.
Henry I was a very successful monarch who ruled for 35 years. Henry III ruled actually for over 50, but he was patchy at best. And then, of course, we ultimately finish up with the very famous Henry VIII, who overall was quite mediocre. Of course,
England didn't just like Henrys, they really liked Edwards. The first one was actually before 1000 AD in the Anglo-Saxon era. In fact, there were 3 Anglo-Saxon King Edwards before you come to the man Edward Longshanks, who became known, ironically, as Edward I. Actually, if you want to know, Edward I was named after Edward the Confessor, an earlier king, so he himself knew he couldn't be Edward I, but he became known as Edward I because his son was Edward II and his grandson was Edward III, so he was the first of 3 Edwards. Edward was indeed a go-to name for about 1,000 years, but this is where things get a little bit tricky with the branding of royal names.
Of course you want to be named Henry if you can be associated with an armour-plated god like Henry V, but Edward VIII, not so successful. It's even worse in France, however, as you can see here. There's 18 Louis and 10 Charleses. Isn't it a little depressing if you're Charles VII? Will anybody ever remember you in history? As we know, what stopped
all the Louis and Charleses in France was, of course, a revolution, which has never happened in Great Britain. Instead, Edward was the go-to name for 1,000 years. However, with Edward VIII abdicating, being the very first monarch to ever do that, the name Edward has become toxic, just as Henry's has. Although, ironically, I don't think Henry VIII was the worst of all the Henrys. But on a similar thought process, that's why Prince Charles won't be Charles III. There's been too long a gap between Charles III, potentially, and Charles II. And let's not forget, Charles I was somebody who had his head cut off. It's not a particularly good brand name. That's why King Stephen, yes, there was a King Stephen, there's only ever been one of them. There's only ever been one King John. In England, there's only ever been 2 Jameses, but because the second one of those, although he was the 7th of Scotland, was so utterly reviled, there will be no more Jameses. So it's all about branding, it's about association. Just as people want to be associated with popular and successful brands or teams or famous Hollywood actors or actresses, it was the same thing 1,000 years ago. Why not use the name that everybody knows? And hopefully you'll be as good as they are. So with that in mind, I think that's a good place to finish.
If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, hit like, and of course you can always find at History Gems on Facebook and on Twitter. See you soon.